The movie begins by portraying the bustling atmosphere of Gothenburg, Sweden, in 1958 during the 6th World Cup tournament. Brazil, a team that has faced major setbacks in the previous 2 World Cups, is also participating in the tournament and is set to play against the Soviet Union. However, with the team's strength and the spirit of its supporters diminishing, Brazil is considered to be at a disadvantage by commentators. One player who stands out is 17-year-old Edson Nascimento, also known as Pele, who is relatively unknown, but is about to make his debut. As preparations are made in the dressing room, Pele readies to take the field and face the Soviet Union football team. 8 years before the World Cup, a young Pele, known as Deco, lived in Bauru, Brazil, with his family. His father, Dindinho, is a retired football player who works as a cleaner at a hospital. At the same time, his mother, Celeste, is a housewife who works as a housekeeper for a wealthy family. Despite living a humble life, Deco does not let it hold him back. He helps earn extra money by shining shoes, and in his free time, he practices football with his father and his friends Diego, Yuri, and Fofinho. On July 17, 1950, the World Cup final match between Brazil and Uruguay was held, and the Brazilian nation, including Dindinho, eagerly gathered around radios to listen to the match. They held high hopes that Brazil would come out as champions that year. Despite being scolded for playing football until their bodies were dirty, Deco and his friends were still eager to listen to the game through the roof hole of the bar. As the radio broadcast progressed, Brazil held a draw against Uruguay, but in the match's final moments, Brazil sadly had to give up the World Cup title after Uruguay scored their second goal, resulting in a final score of 2-1 in favor of Uruguay's victory. Dindinho and others looked saddened by Brazil's defeat, and even Deco cried upon learning of his country's team's loss. During the evening, Deco promises his father that someday he will lead Brazil win the World Cup. Dindinho, who heard this, reminds him that he should stay away from football and focus on finishing school. The next day, Deco helps his mother, Celeste, mop up the kitchen floor at the home of a conglomerate, who has a son named Jose, the captain of the city's famous football team, the Kings. While mopping, Celeste recounts her past with Dindinho, who used to be a footballer, but due to a severe injury to his knee, he was forced to be dismissed, without severance pay by the football club. This is why Dindinho and Celeste disagree with Deco's desire to become a footballer like his father. After that, Celeste leaves Deco as her employer calls her, while Deco continues his work mopping the floor. Not long after, Jose and his football team enter the house, while their shoes covered in dirt. They are discussing a club-friendly tournament, in search of young Brazilian footballers. With his arrogance, Jose takes the tournament lightly, but he plans to participate, because a famous former footballer named Waldemar de Brito will come to the final match in search of new players for the Santos football club. Deco, who is interested in football, tries to join in on the conversation by saying he also wants to be a football player like Pele, but he is ridiculed for not knowing Pele's real name and for his humble background. Even Jose, who does not like him, throws a ball toward the bucket, causing the water he used to mop the floor to spill. But fortunately, Celeste comes to Deco's aid, while Jose and his friends leave the kitchen. Aware of the Bauru Youth Club tournament, Deco invited his friends to join the match. On the day of the match, Deco's team, who initially lacked confidence as they were not as well equipped as other teams, became even more excited after Yuri stitched up a simple uniform for them. However, Fofinho could not wear a uniform that was too small for him. Despite their lack of equipment, Deco and his friends played exceptionally well, making it to the final round and facing off against the Kings team. As Deco and his teammates began to be ridiculed by the Kings players and spectators for not having football boots, Fofinho came up with the idea to steal peanuts and resell them to buy football boots for the team. When Deco and his friends start selling their goods, Jose and his team come to mock them, causing him to become angry and fight with Jose and his friends, resulting in him getting beaten up. When Deco gets home, Celeste asks who beat him, but he lies and says it was his teacher at school. Upon hearing this, Celeste is furious and intends to confront Deco's teacher at school. But Dindinho, knowing the truth, quickly asks her to go to work and tells her he will handle it instead. Not long after, Dindinho takes Deco to the field for the youth club tournament, as he knows he is participating. He also advises him that Jose's violent behavior because he is afraid of losing and wants to make Deco unable to play optimally during the game. Dindinho reminds him that he should not be ashamed of his background and to always strive to be the best player he can be. Feeling supported by his father, Deco is even more eager to compete. Unfortunately, Deco's 3 friends start to feel insecure after the incident with Jose and his friends. Diego decided to take off his glasses, Yuri wore a hat to cover his long hair, and the self-imposed Fofinho wore a too small uniform. Even Deco and his team, ridiculed for not wearing football boots, chose to wear oversized shoes. When the game started, Deco and his friends, who were uncomfortable with all the things they wore, couldn't perform optimally against the Kings team and were falling behind 6 goals. Deco then remembered Dindinho's advice to accept his shortcomings, so he began to take off his shoes and accept when the Kings team called him Pele. Seeing Deco's action, his friends also started to embrace who they were and played with their unique skills, impressing the audience, and they managed to catch up with 5 goals. Unfortunately, Deco's team had to remain defeated with a final score of 6-5 for the Kings' victory. Despite the loss, Deco's game received much praise from everyone, including Waldemar, who gave his business card to Dindinho as he was impressed with Deco's skills. In the excitement of the game, Deco and his friends suddenly saw some of the peanut vendors they had stolen from earlier around the field, so they immediately ran to escape. Deco and Thiago decided to hide in a hole to avoid the vendors, while Yuri and Fofinho continued to be chased by the vendors. Inside the hole, the wall collapsed due to heavy rainfall. Deco managed to escape, but Thiago could not save himself after a larger landslide occurred and buried him. After Thiago's death, Deco blamed himself and felt that he may still be alive if they hadn't forced themselves to steal the peanuts to buy new shoes. Celeste tried to comfort him as she hugged him. When Celeste returned to her room, Dindinho handed Waldemar business card and mentioned that the former footballer had expressed interest in Deco's talents. However, Celeste opposed the idea of Deco becoming a professional footballer, as she did not want him to face the same fate as Dindinho, whose team had left him behind after suffering an injury. Instead, she suggested that Deco focus on completing his education, while helping Dindinho at the hospital to overcome the grief of Thiago's death. Eventually, Deco began to come to terms with the situation and regain his passion for football. He started practicing juggling with Dindinho using mangoes as a ball. 5 years later, Celeste, who had often seen Deco practicing football with Dindinho, finally contacted Waldemar using the business card. One day, Deco was surprised by the arrival of Waldemar, who had invited him to take an entrance exam for the Santos football team. Deco was overjoyed and immediately hugged Celeste, who had finally allowed him to pursue his dream of becoming a professional footballer. After accepting Waldemar's offer, Dindinho and Celeste supported Deco by requesting their salaries early so that he could buy the necessary equipment for his new role on the Santos team. Sometime later, Deco said goodbye to his family before leaving with Waldemar for Santos. Deco, who had been accepted into the Santos Football Academy, began training with the team. However, his use of the Ginga style of play was considered outdated by Coach Santos, making it difficult for him to score in matches, as he was not allowed to use his signature technique. Despite the initial challenges, Deco remained determined, and after a week of training, he finally earned a spot on the Santos youth team. Deco, not wanting to give up, continued to train alone every night to improve the techniques taught to him by the coach. Waldemar, who often observed his persistence and dedication, noticed his hard work. Despite his hard work and dedication, Deco still struggled to master the techniques taught by his coach and found it difficult to score goals. As a result, he decided to pack his things and return to Boru. As Deco sat waiting for the train, Waldemar approached him and asked why he had given up on his dream of becoming a footballer. He explained that he did not possess the impressive abilities of other players, and his coach had never allowed him to use the Ginga technique on the pitch. Waldemar then shared the history and origins of the Ginga technique, and the reason why the coach had prohibited him from using it during games. In the 16th century, when the Portuguese colonized Brazil, they brought many slaves from Africa, and some tried to escape and take refuge in the forest. To defend themselves, they developed a martial art called Ginga, which later became the foundation of a modern martial art called capoeira. After slavery was abolished, Ginga was banned as it was considered a dangerous martial art. But people later saw that football was a place where they could practice Ginga legally. Unfortunately, many people saw the Ginga style as the reason for Brazil's defeat in the 1950 World Cup, so the coach tried to eliminate it, so that the same defeat would not be repeated. Unlike Coach Santos, Waldemar wanted Deco to showcase his unique identity and abilities using the Ginga technique. After Waldemar left, Deco began to reflect on all the advice he had been given, and eventually decided to stay and prove that his Ginga style could be successful in football. A few weeks later, Waldemar was seen sitting on the sidelines watching Deco's game, where Santos was falling behind 3 goals. Deco, who had fallen and lost focus, got back up after seeing Waldemar standing on the edge of the field and staring at him. He also remembered the various techniques taught by Dindinho and decided to ignore his coach's instruction, as he wanted to showcase his unique Ginga style and break through the opposing team's defense. The crowd at the stadium was amazed by Deco's clever playing technique, and even his coach praised him for it. He continued using the technique and ultimately scored 4 goals, leading to Santos' victory. With the Ginga technique, Deco's career at Santos continued to flourish, and he was even selected as one of the top goal scorers at the club. One day, Deco had the opportunity to return home to Boru and brought many gifts for his family. Not long after, Deco, along with Dindinho and Zoka, waited anxiously for the announcement of the players selected to represent the Brazilian national team in the 1958 World Cup to be held in Sweden. To their surprise, the 16-year-old Deco was selected as one of the players, making Dindinho and Zoka excited, while he sat in silence, still unable to believe that he would represent his country in the World Cup. Before returning to Santos, Deco took the time to meet with Yuri, who told him that he and Fafnho had robbed a shop, and as a result, Fafnho had been jailed for 1 year. Yuri expressed that he is proud of his football career and will continue to support his dreams. Not long after, Deco met with Dindino, who gave him the football team uniform he had worn as a child, with the name Pele written on the back. Dindino explained that it was the name shouted by the crowd as he scored his first goal in the tournament. Dindino also reminded him not to make the same mistake he had made in the past by hesitating to use the Ginga technique on the pitch, which led to a severe injury and ended his professional career as a footballer. A few days later, Deco attended a press conference announcing the players representing Brazil at the World Cup. Deco noticed that many players, including Jose, now known as Mazzola, were arrogant. During the interview, a reporter asked about the possibility of using the Ginga style in the World Cup games. Before Deco could answer, the Brazil national team coach, Pele, took the microphone and stated that he had forbidden all players from using the technique to prevent a repeat of Brazil's defeat in the previous World Cup. On the first day of training as a member of the Brazilian national team, Deco received a rebuke from Pele, who asked him not to use the Ginga style on the field. He wanted to change the negative image of Brazil, which had attacked the Hungarian team with broken bottles after their loss in the quarterfinals of the 1954 World Cup. He wanted to win with a more civilized technique by eliminating the use of the Ginga style. Training continued for a full month, and another Brazilian national team player named Garrincha advised Deco to use the technique that Jose had applied during the matches to gain Pele's favor during the World Cup. Despite the pressure, Deco still believed that the Ginga style was the best technique for Brazilian football. One day, during a training session, Deco continued to try to play using the Ginga technique, but Pele kept shouting at him. As a result, he became unsure of his game and sustained a knee injury due to hesitating movements. In the dressing room, Pele and the rest of the team heard a radio news broadcast criticizing the Brazilian national team and Deco for being injured after using the Ginga technique considered a street technique. Despite the ridicule, Pele did not exclude Deco from the national team as the World Cup match was approaching. After the Brazilian national team arrived in Sweden, negative news about the team continued to surface. It was a common thing for the host country to mock the Brazilian national team. Meanwhile, Deco continued to receive treatment from doctors to recover from his knee injury. The Brazilian national team continued to play in the World Cup and won 3-0 against Austria. However, their match against England ended in a draw, and 3 Brazilian players, including Jose as a striker, could not play in the next game due to injury. Fortunately, Deco's knee had fully recovered, so Pele asked him to replace Jose in the game against the Soviet Union. Deco was visibly nervous in his first match as he stepped onto the field. Meanwhile, Dindino and other residents of Bùllied gathered to watch his first match as a striker in the World Cup. Deco's addition to the team on the field did not seem to impact Brazil's game significantly, but they still beat the Soviet Union 2-0. In the semi-finals, Deco continued to play as a striker for Brazil in their match against France, but his movements were uncertain and had the potential to cause back injuries. The first half ended with a temporary score of 2-1 in Brazil's favor, but the players' morale seemed to decline as they faced France's attacks. Deco even asked Jose to recover quickly to replace him, feeling that he was not playing as well as him. Jose, who was not injured, said he couldn't play because he was depressed about wanting to play like a European player, whereas the Brazilian game would be much more effective if the players used the Ginga technique. When they were children, he was reminded of his match with Deco when he used a beautiful and effective Ginga technique to break through the opponent's defense. As the second half began, Deco remembered Jose's words in the dressing room and finally used the Ginga style to break through the French defense and score his first goal with a bicycle kick move. In the following minutes, Deco also led Brazil to victory over France by scoring 3 goals and closing the match with a final score of 5-2. Pele and the players were ecstatic about the win. In the final round, Brazil will play against the host team Sweden. All football analysts predicted that Brazil would lose to Sweden due to their lack of experience and technique, which was considered less refined. Before the final match, Deco received advice from Dindino over the phone to stay confident and use his Ginga technique to help his team regain their excitement for the game. While at the hotel, Deco took the initiative to encourage his teammates by juggling the ball, getting them excited. Pele, who witnessed this, realized that it was the Ginga technique that united Brazil, and thus he asked all players to play without pressure using the Ginga technique. The next day, the World Cup final between Brazil and Sweden began. All the residents of Bùllied gathered to watch the match. In the early minutes, the Sweden players played rough, but the referee did not issue any warnings until they scored their first goal. Deco, not wanting to be discouraged, began to play with the ball he received and was able to outmaneuver some of the opposing players and score a goal for Brazil. The match continued, and the spectators were amazed by the Ginga style when Deco was playing on the field. At the end of the match, Deco managed to score again, and shortly after the final whistle sounded, Brazil finally secured its first World Cup victory by defeating Sweden with a final score of 5-2. Deco is excited with the win, couldn't believe that his country could become World Cup winners. The residents of Bauru also rejoiced at the victory of the Brazilian team. At the end of the movie, it shows how Deco, known as Pele, fulfilled his promise to Dindino by leading his country to become World Cup winners for the first time at such a young age. With his game, people's views about the Ginga style changed, and it became the hallmark of the Brazilian game until this day. The moral of the movie is that people can be true to themselves when they accept their shortcomings and strengths. It's also about not giving up on your dreams and the importance of perseverance and hard work.